So first we've got Rodney from WSP and University of Melbourne. And grey-headed flying foxes are really mobile. They move up and down the east coast of Australia, moving thousands of kilometres, and perform important pollination and seed dispersal services along the way. And for those that can remember back long ago, it was really exciting when they first established a permanent colony in Victoria for the first time back in the 1980s. And now it's expanded, and we've got a lot more flying foxes coming down to Victoria. And so in this presentation, Rodney will summarise the establishment and expansion of the grey-headed flying foxes in Victoria and discuss some of the management challenges associated with this highly mobile, iconic and often contentious species. So over to you, Rodney, if you want to share your screen and get going.
Yeah, so flying foxes, people either seem to love them or hate them, and there's not very much in between. But yeah, as Lindy said, I'll be talking to you today about, I guess, the history of flying foxes, particularly the grey-headed flying fox in Victoria, because if we'd had this presentation, maybe 30 odd years ago, most Victorians would just look at you blankly as if to say, what are you talking about? But not so much anymore. And the flying fox story in Victoria, at least, is in many ways a story about human-wildlife conflict. So I guess back in the 80s and the 90s, flying foxes didn't really exist that much. I mean, they were in Victoria, but in very low numbers and very occasionally. And then when things turn up unexpectedly, often in large numbers and right where people want to live, that can create some concern, particularly in a novel sort of context. But when you look at the flying foxes, how could anyone take umbrage against such a cute looking thing? We have 4 flying foxes on mainland Australia. We've got the spectacled flying fox, which is shown up here in the far north on Cape York in the black. We've got the black flying fox, which is the stripy orange and yellow colours, and it's across the north of Australia and down to Brisbane or just below the New South Wales, Queensland border on the east coast. The little red flying fox has got the largest distribution of all, and it's also across the north and then down most of Queensland, New South Wales and into Victoria. And the species that I'll be talking mostly about today is the grey-headed flying fox, which extends from southern Queensland down into Victoria and into Adelaide in South Australia. And there's a bit of a gap here between the Adelaide distribution and the Victorian distribution, which that gap is now largely filled. As Lindy mentioned, they roost in groups, and we call those camps, is the location. When they're together, they're a colony, is the group of the bats. And those colonies or camps can number anywhere from, a few hundred to tens of thousands, sometimes up to and exceeding 100,000. Generally, though, in Victoria, you'll see later on, typically around the 5 to sort of 35,000 in each camp on average. When they're feeding, they're out alone or in small groups, and they're feeding on blossoms and fruit. And that can be from a whole range of species, not just native or indigenous species, but also fruit and introduced or European trees. We've tried to figure out and understand why they choose certain roost locations. It's a bit vague, but some of the general ideas that we have began to understand is that it's pretty much always associated with water. So that could be the coast, lakes, rivers and swamps. That's partly from a microclimate perspective, but also on really hot days, as Layla will get into later, they need that water to drink. So they'll do belly flops on the water and then get their chest wet, and then they'll return to their trees and drink the water off their chest. So that's a really important contribution. The other part is just somewhere to hang. And that structure can be anything from tall eucalypts, dense rainforest, melaleuca scrub, mangroves, palm trees, and European-style trees, such as this radiata pine in the photo there. And the other really important thing is that it's located near to or centrally to food sources. So just like us, when we choose somewhere to live or think about where the local shops are, where the things we want to do each day or our, fun activities, we will choose when we can to live next to those resources. Generally, what happens is, well, I guess there's two kind of contexts when the roost or the camp becomes a problem. The first is when there is an area that flying foxes have been roosting in for a long time. So this is up near Coffs Harbour. They've been roosting on the old black and white photo. You can see there, they're just in some trees along a creek, surrounded by paddocks, mostly, not too much of an issue. But then over time, people think that's also a good spot to live. So they'll move in and they'll get closer and closer to the flying foxes. And that becomes a bit of a problem when it's, for some people at least, when it's right in your backyard, essentially. And I'm not, I don't mind flying foxes. In fact, I've studied them for probably 20, 25 years. But I'm not sure that I would really like them in my backyard, particularly at certain times of the year when they're flying in and out of the roost at 3 or 4 in the morning. It can get rather loud. So there are some challenges certainly with locations of the roost. The other problem or challenge arises when they're choosing roosts that they seemingly haven't been in before. And that's often the case. Many of the roosts in Victoria, the flying foxes have just turned up for a range of different reasons, and we have to adapt to that situation and understand that the flying foxes are there for a reason. So many of the botanic gardens and central parks in many of the towns and regional areas across Victoria have had or have flying foxes in them. So a little, excuse me, a little bit about the history. So there are records of flying foxes in Victoria as far back as European history has recorded, and also Indigenous history also tells us that flying foxes have been a part of Victoria for as long as anyone can remember. Until recently, though, most of those records were occasional sort of records of small numbers of flying foxes, and then usually they were in Victoria and around the Melbourne area during summer and autumn, and during winter they'd fly back up north into New South Wales and Queensland. And that sort of continued up until about the late 70s, I suppose, early 80s, when the flying foxes, grey-headed flying foxes, first arrived at the Botanic Gardens. In 86, there was about 1,000 of them that were roosting there in autumn, and about 10 or 15 overwintered for the first time in Victoria. And that led Helen Aston, who was working at the gardens, to, make this prediction that became true, that potentially this raises the possibility that there'll be a permanent camp of grey-headed flying foxes in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. So this is the data that has been collected since the early 80s about flying foxes in the Botanic Gardens. There's a number of different ways that we can count grey-headed flying foxes. The traditional methods are a static count, which is where someone or a group of people walk around the colony and try and count or estimate the number of bats in the colony. That works pretty well when it's a small colony and you've got good access, but when there's a large colony and not many access tracks, it gets hard to do. A fly-out count is where a group of people stand around the colony at dusk and we all count a different stream of bats as they fly out, and we try and estimate how many are there. Recently, we've turned to things like the weather radar from the Bureau of Meteorology and using drones with heat-sensitive cameras to try and pick them up. In any case, we used static counts and fly-out counts at Melbourne, and the numbers were typically around the few hundred to a few thousand up until the late 90s, and then the numbers increased, and there was about somewhere between 20 and 30,000 at the beginning of 2003, which was when a decision was made to relocate the bats out of the Botanic Gardens. Before we get to that, though, that process, the question is, why did they arrive and settle? Well, so it's warmer in Melbourne than it used to be from the urban heat island. Climate change is a contributor, habitat loss elsewhere, and Melbourne is now an all-you-can-eat smorgasbord in terms of flying fox food. And I'll illustrate each of those in the next few slides. So this one represents the mean daily minimum temperature in July. And you can see that in the last 50 odd years, most of the years have been above that mean daily minimum temperature. So that's particularly good if you're a subtropical species. When we look at the food availability in Melbourne, we know that grey-headed flying foxes across eastern Australia eat about 180. We know it's now more, but this is back in about around 2000. There was 180 odd species. 32 of those species were in Victoria, and about only 11 were in Melbourne. But since we've arrived, or European settlement at least, there's been at least 129, probably close to 150 non-Indigenous trees and shrubs and things that flying foxes eat that we've now planted across Melbourne. And just simply, this is City of Melbourne, two of their favourite food species, the Moreton Bay fig in blue and the spotted gum in red. And you can see that even in the CBD, there's plenty of food for flying foxes. And we can see where they're feeding. So these are 4 animals that we tracked in 2005 with the satellite transmitters, and most of their foraging are in parts of the built up residential parts of Melbourne, including quite high density areas around Fitzroy and Carlton. This was the hipster bat hanging out in the funky parts of Melbourne. So yeah, 35,000-ish bats in the Botanic Gardens was causing some damage to the canopy. There was mixed views about this. So this was a bit of an attraction for many people to come to the gardens, but it also wasn't very conducive to the objectives of a Botanic Garden. And lots of failed attempts over the years to try and manage the problem. And it wasn't going very well. And so a decision was made to do this properly. So over a 3-year period, and this is a really short, abridged version of this process, lots of research, lots of meeting, lots of approvals and management plans, lots of research was undertaken. And we began to, and this was right when I began working, actually. I just finished studying, got a job here, and began working on this project. So we identified a number of ways to disperse bats from a location. We also set up a captive colony at Horseshoe Bend, which was our preferred location. We had these captive bats in the cage. We had free food available for free-flying bats. We got leaf litter from the Botanic Gardens. We set up a PA and we played sounds of happy bats that we'd recorded from elsewhere. And we had these decoy or pretend bats hanging in the trees. The attraction was a complete failure. Essentially, we did not get any bats. There was a handful that came for the free food, but yeah, largely unsuccessful process attracting bats. The dispersal, so Royal Botanic Gardens in the middle, Yarra Bend Park, which is the current place where the flying fox colony is, and Horseshoe Bend was our preferred location at the time. As I said, 3-year process for planning, but it was actually only, I say only in inverted commas, it was a 6-month process to move the bats from the Botanic Gardens to Yarra Bend, which I'll try to go through briefly now. So pre-dawn, basically scaring the bats out of the Botanic Gardens. And this is 2003, a slightly different time to now. Half the colony moved to Geelong. A portion of them went to Fitzroy Gardens and another portion of them returned up north as part of their annual migration. So that took about 2 or 3 weeks. And then the next 4 or 5 months was spent essentially chasing the bats out of pretty much every park and major garden around Melbourne until they landed on the Yarra River at the base of this blue arrow. And then from that point on, rather than dispersing them pre-dawn, we would start at sort of 10 o'clock in the morning and gently nudge them up the river until they got to Yarra Bend. And that was a very long process. And then when they got to Yarra Bend, it was realised that, maybe that's just as good a spot as Horseshoe Bend, and that's where they've been ever since. Much more involved than that. But I would say that this is one of the only maybe 2 or 3 examples of successful relocations. They are rarely successful, and most of the time they end in failure. Essentially what happens is we push the problem somewhere else. It's very expensive. I think a couple of $1 million was spent back in 2003. Often it needs to be repeated because the bats, they're mobile, they fly long distances, they just return to the original location. And this can be done, may need to be done many times. There are some very real animal welfare concerns, so it's a stressful process. We didn't have any mortality that we detected in Melbourne, but it can happen, and certain times a year it's not allowed to happen at all. There's also ethical considerations, so it's an endangered species, and do we really want to be setting a precedent that anytime there's an inconvenient, in inverted commas, wildlife, that we can just get up and push them around? I don't think so. And there's also recent research showing that when animals are stressed, that can lead to disease spillover issues between wildlife and people. And do we really want to be, not encouraging, but causing that issue? But nevertheless, it is, it's a really conflicted space, because imagine if this was your park and you're the manager of this garden, and all of a sudden there's 150,000 flying foxes turning up. I've been to a number of botanic gardens in Queensland where I was told that it's been like a tornado has come through, and I thought, you're just overreacting. And then I went to the park, and trees, like branches 30, 40, 50 centimeters diameter, ripped off the trees. And that can happen when there's 150,000 bats turning up. So it is a really contested space, a conflicted space, and there are some challenging management issues to work through. The Yarra Bend population size. So in 2003 is when we got them to Yarra Bend. There was about 20,000 in 2004. And this has been the population trajectory for the last 20 years. And I've got February's data in there as well. What's interesting to note here is that the first 8 to 10 years of when they were at Yarra Bend, fairly consistent sort of numbers in Victoria and at Yarra Bend. And then there are these major sort of eruptions or fluctuations which occur. And we've just had one of those this summer in Melbourne, although it's a little uncertain just from this graph. But these major fluctuations happen when there's major storms and floods and things up north in New South Wales and Queensland that result in food shortage in those areas, which drives flying foxes into Victoria. And so what we see at these particular times, or these particular years, we see major eruptions of flying foxes in Victoria. So with this really technical and highly proficient mapping exercise, I'm going to show you, I guess, the history of flying foxes in Victoria. So East Gippsland is where they've typically been off and on prior to arriving at the Botanic Gardens. And then in the mid-80s, they arrived in the Botanic Gardens. Not much happened there or around the state until about 2003, when they were moved to Yarra Bend. A colony formed in Geelong, and Warrnambool and Bairnsdale all happened at around about the same time. Then nothing really changed until about 2010, and a colony formed in Bacchus Marsh. When I've shown an area or a location with a solid circle, that means it's either occupied year-round permanently or it's occupied seasonally, but in most years. Anything with a dashed line is just an occasional camp. So Bacchus Marsh 2010, Adelaide 2010, Bendigo 2010, Seymour, Ballarat, Nathalia, all sort of established or were occupied in 2010. Also in the Otways, Albury happened in about 2014. Cerberus, also 2014. Dufton, about 2015, 2016. Sale, around about the same time. Namurka, Werribee Park, similarly, Can River. Datura, set up in about 2017. Lots and lots of camps forming over the past few years. So now what we see are camps just about all over most of Victoria, including in the far west, Lilydale just in the last few weeks, Ballarat again in the last month or two. There's some camps in Western Victoria, central Western Victoria. Swan Hill, there's some recent records. Cows on Phillip Island, Wangaratta, recent colony. So from this kind of hodgepodge of locations, you can see that there's not many areas in Victoria where flying foxes haven't been observed and haven't set up a colony just yet. And in areas where they haven't, it's probably only a matter of time before we start to see them in those areas. I think one of the main reasons that this is happening is because the grey-headed flying foxes are super mobile. So this is some satellite tracking work that Justin Wellbergen from the University of Western Sydney worked on. In the top 3 panels, we've got different species. The grey-headed flying fox is in the middle. Every blue dot is a flying fox camp that his animals used. And he got most of his animals collared in Sydney and elsewhere in New South Wales. None of them were from Melbourne. So what's interesting there is that there's very few of the camps in Victoria, certainly compared to the previous map. But there's, I think, half of the colonies that his animals, and he tracked more than 100, were new colonies that we didn't know about. So I suspect there's probably more in Victoria and more interstate that we don't know about yet. And the bottom panels show the movements of those satellite tracked individuals, and the blue line represents one single individual that moved over 2,000 kilometres from Gippsland all the way north of Brisbane. Which is remarkable. Over about 12, 18 months, I think that animal was tracked for. So what we now know is that flying foxes are moving between all the camps all the time. We used to think there was a Melbourne colony and half of them left, and then they'd returned after the seasonal migration. But in actual fact, there's animals moving between all the camps all the time. If you haven't come across this resource yet, I do recommend having a look at it. It's the National Flying Fox Viewer, and I'll take you to the website and I'll show you what that looks like. Basically, can someone confirm that you can see the Flying Fox Viewer on screen now? Yep, great.
Can see it.
Thank you. So basically, it's for all the different species, but it's targeting grey-headed and spectacled flying foxes, but you can see camps for all of them. So at the moment, we're showing all the camps that we know of in Australia, and you can zoom along the bottom and pick, okay, I'm interested in where the camps were in 2018, and I'm only interested in grey-headed flying foxes. So you can select your species, select your time of year, and have a look to see what's going on. Importantly too, it shows you some indication about the size of the colony at the time. So large circles, this one here's got in Adelaide between 16,000 and 50,000. Melbourne looks like it's a bit bigger, probably more than 50,000 potentially. And yeah, you can zoom in and have a closer look at all the different camps at different times of the year. So I recommend checking that out. And the other one that I'll take you to as well is just to give you, I guess, another overview of how rapidly the flying foxes are moving. So this is an animation of all the satellite tracked animals that Justin Wellbergen tracked. And it looks like it's not going to play ball today. It's fascinating because you can basically see all the movements of the animals. Let's try this one. No. Anyway, I do recommend checking that out. The link's there, yeah, you'll be able to find it, and it shows really rapid movements of 100 different animals between all the different camps. I guess the last thing I want to leave you with is the change, what this means for Victoria as a place for conservation of grey-headed flying foxes. So hypothetically speaking, but realistic, big year with large numbers in Victoria of grey-headed flying foxes. These are some of the major camps, typical numbers. I've added about a 10% increase on the maximum number we've seen in any of these camps at any time. That would relate or equate to about 300,000 flying foxes, which is somewhere around the 45 to 50% of the national grey-headed flying fox population. If there is a major shortfall of food, perhaps in New South Wales and Queensland, and I've hypothetically said maybe that results in an increase of 20 to 30%, that could result in Victoria hosting 75% of the national population. I've just made these numbers up, the estimates of the increase. So I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, but what I'm trying to highlight is that Victoria now plays a really important role in the conservation of grey-headed flying foxes, whereas 20 or 30 years ago, this was not the case. So my take-home messages, flying foxes, really important species, performing important ecosystem services like long-distance pollination, seed dispersal. They fly 2,000 kilometres, nothing else that feeds on these food sources travels the same sort of distances at the same frequency. Moving camps all the time, they know where all the camps are, they know where all the food is, and they're constantly moving between them. In many cases, we're responsible for them coming to the towns. We've planted the trees, the eucalypts in our backyards, and we've reforested our urban areas with a diversity of species. We water our parks and gardens, so the food's available year round. There's impacts of climate change as a subtropical species moving into Melbourne because it's warmer. The camp relocations, it has worked on a very small number of occasions, but by far and away, most of those attempted relocations have been a complete failure and are not recommended. What's really important though is good monitoring and data collection, so we know what the flying foxes are doing and where they are, and we need that information so that we can manage them well. And we also need education and management of the communities in which the flying foxes are choosing to live, because they're here to stay, and for many reasons we need to learn to live with them. And that is all. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
There's lots of questions, Rod. Thank you so much. A really excellent presentation and overview of what's happening. So we've got just a few minutes. There's lots of people in the chat that have put in comments of other places that they've seen flying foxes. So I'll leave you to have a look at those later. But one of the questions is, once a colony declines, is there a particular cohort that sticks around? Is it the older animals, younger animals, or is that known?
I don't think that's known, but what I do in huge detail. So we haven't really studied, the composition of a colony in super detail. But what Justin's work did show, this was the satellite tracking, there's about a 15% chance that an animal will change colonies on a day-to-day basis. So you could imagine that if there's 100,000 bats, 15,000 of them are changing, moving camp every day. So that says something about the high turnover.
And is there any way, based on the historical data and observations, we can anticipate that there'll be, a significant increase in grey-headed flying foxes further south due to climate extremes outside of Victoria? Is there a way of quantifying that rate, such as the number of individuals compared to weather conditions, or that can help predict the extent of the migration?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the way that we could tackle that is it's called bioclimatic modelling in a sense. So we figure out what conditions the animal climatic conditions the animal can survive in, and then we model what the future climate will look like and see where they could end up. I guess a major challenge between what's south of Melbourne, at least, is Tasmania. We have occasionally had grey-headed flying foxes. I think 2010, there's a photo of a flying fox hanging on the windscreen of a crane on an oil rig in Bass Strait. And then there's been a couple of bats that made it to Tassie, but they've died shortly thereafter. So I think the distance there is probably the major constraint. But did we predict, hundreds of thousands of flying foxes in Victoria 20 years ago? Certainly not. So anything's possible.
Yep. A couple of people asked about the bomb weather data and how does that work in terms of estimating numbers, maybe just briefly.
Yeah, so essentially the camp, it works by counting the flying foxes at camps that are close to a radar. So it doesn't work for those particularly remote camps unless you happen to have a Bureau of Meteorology rain radar nearby. And the rain radar data is made available generally anyway. And so what happened was, Justin Wellbergen and his students, Jessica Mead, they got the radar data. They combined it with my static and fly out count data, and we correlated the two techniques. And so they've basically developed a corrective, factor, I suppose, or way of estimating flying fox numbers from what the radar looks like, because it's essentially picking up shapes, and whether those shapes are clouds or those shapes are flying foxes, and then we can estimate the flying fox numbers.
Yep, and it's showing fantastic data and fantastic correlations, and can go back a long time, which is amazing. Maybe just to finish up, you've mentioned the role that flying foxes play in terms of a bit on seed dispersal and pollination, but can you outline a bit more detail as to what their role is in the health of our forest systems or trees in general?
Yeah, great question. So when they're feeding on nectar and pollen and fruit. So from a nectar and pollen perspective, there's some amazing photos of flying foxes with their faces completely covered in pollen. And then if they're, on a typical night of feeding, they might be flying 50, 60 kilometres from the camp and 50 to 60 kilometres back. And then when they're moving, they can fly between camps, they can be flying a few hundred kilometres in a night. And so what they're doing is they're taking this genetic material from one area of the forest and moving it to another area of the forest. So they're basically maintaining the genetic diversity of the forest, which is really important from a forest health perspective. And then in terms of seed dispersal, while they've got a pretty quick digestive system and they're not dispersing the seeds quite as far as they are potentially the pollen, they're still moving seeds, kilometres from where they ate, and that's an important seed dispersal process.
Fantastic. So they're really important animals to have around.
Absolutely.
Hey, thank you so much, Rodney. That was wonderful.